Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give folks a few minutes to join and get logged into the webinar, and then we will get started. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Thomas Rogers from Whiteboard Advisors, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's conversation. As everyone on this call likely knows, cell phone policies have become one of the most hotly debated topics in K-12 education. So far, more than 40 states have enacted some form of restriction. Parents, teachers, and students all have strong feelings, as we've heard, seen survey data and otherwise to show. And school and district leaders are somewhat caught in the middle of trying to figure out what works and not just what sounds good in a news story. So today we're going to dig in a little bit deeper, have a panel that brings together folks with research, advocacy, and practitioner backgrounds, and talk about what, not just what the bans mean, but what comes after the ban. And I think each of our panelists will help us get a fuller picture of what schools are dealing with and where the field is headed. I'm going to take a moment and just do a quick introductions of our panelists. Angela Duckworth is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and the researcher behind Phones in Focus, which has surveyed more than 100,000 educators on cell phone policies. Jonah Edelman is the CEO of Stand for Children, which recently released a cell phone free guide for educators using some of Angela's research. Julia Gustafson is co-founder of The Commons, which is building a technology-based approach to help schools manage student device use. Lisa Masta is the CEO of Learning.com, which recently published a white paper on digital literacy, cell phone bans, and why the conversation can't stop with just banning devices. And finally, Joseph South, the Chief Innovation Officer at ISTE-ASCD, which is the largest ed tech and educator membership organization in the country. Welcome, everyone. Thank you to our panelists for joining us. We will have time for questions toward the end. So as things come up, drop them into the Q&A feature at the bottom, and we'll get to as many as we can. So, Angela, I want to start with you. Phones in Focus, you surveyed now 100,000 educators, and you've published some preliminary findings, and I know you have some newer data that you were going to share or talk about today, and so I'll let you kick us off.
Thanks for having me. I think we were saying to each other on the panel just before we got started that this may be one of the very few bipartisan issues there is in this country. And I would affirm that we are working with most states in the union, and we do have about 1 in 2 high schools in America who are part of the survey, for example, close to that for middle schools as well. And so what are we seeing? The first take-home finding is that there is not just one dimension of school cell phone policies, like do you have a bell-to-bell policy or do you not have a bell-to-bell policy? There are 2 dimensions, and we're seeing most of the movement on the first. So to be clear, in this country, if you look at what was going on last school year in our K-12 schools, particularly our middle and high schools, where a lot of the changes are happening, elementary schools have had restrictive policies and they continue to. But in this country, middle schools and high schools are moving towards more restrictive policies. You see a lot of movement toward bell-to-bell policies across the 50 states. And these are not just the states that have enacted state legislation. And what schools are moving away from are either having no policy, like when students use their phones is just up to individual teachers, or many schools are moving to bell from having what are called scheduled restriction policies, meaning you can use it during scheduled periods. You can use your phone during lunch, for example, or in the hallway between classes. So we are moving more towards a bell. You cannot use your phone from the first bell to the last bell of the school day. That's the when dimension. But I just want to say that there's another dimension that I think is incredibly important as a psychologist who studies self-control and delay of gratification, and that is the where dimension. Where are students in this school allowed to keep their phones, regardless of when they are allowed to use them? And that is a little more complex. So there are very restrictive policies like, all the phones go to the main office in the beginning of the day. You got to go back to the main office at the end of the day to pick up your phone, all the way to having no policy at all. And here I'll just say that along that gradient, there has not been much movement that we're seeing across the country. And I think that is an area of discussion that we can get more into as the panel continues. And I can say more, but I'm mindful that they're very educated people, so I can say more about what we're finding. Maybe I'll say one more thing. The stricter the policy, the happier the educator. The stricter the policy, the more educators are reporting the students are focused in class. The stricter the policy, the more teachers are observing that students are interacting with each other outside of class as opposed to being on their phones. So I will say that and then uh, leave some time and space for these other wonderful panelists.
Yeah. Joseph, I want to turn to you next. So you spend a lot of time every day talking to school and district leaders across the country. How does what Angela is describing match what you're hearing from those school and district leaders? And what are the big questions you're hearing at ISTASCD?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot of alignment there where definitely schools and school leaders are really concerned about the distraction that's brought in by cell phones. And for that matter, any sort of unfiltered technology that comes in is going to be hugely distracting. Um, I think, and there's a lot of pressure to just turn off this tap, right? Make the cell phone inaccessible and remove it from the equation. I think the thing that they're wrestling with, though, is, how do we protect students' focus in the classroom? How do we help them really dial in without accidentally teaching them that the only way to manage technology is to have an adult take it away, right? And so they're wondering about this trade-off between not helping the students learn to manage that technology as an option, not giving them any access, even when there might be a pedagogical reason that it makes sense, against the backdrop of trying to just get their arms around a massive distraction problem. And so I think those are some of the things that they're thinking through.
And so, Jonah, Stand for Children recently released a set of very specific recommendations, bell-to-bell policies being one of those, physical storage, a framework for what happens when a student violates those policies. What led you to take such a clear position on that?
I mean, I just agree with what Joseph said, and obviously, Angela's just been such an amazing, um, uh, resource in terms of, for the first time, helping us understand, what's going on across the country and iteratively improving that understanding. This is a massive, massive problem. I mean, it's a massive problem, and I think, Angela's the researcher, but I think there's going to be research, I think, over time that shows that this is a significant factor in the decline of our the learning across the country. We've been flat. There's a lot of reasons why, but there's no doubt that distractions play a very significant role. And when you talk to instructors, it's very clear. I'm the dad of 20-year-old kids, and so very unfortunately for them, they came of age at the time when phones were ubiquitous and there wasn't as much consciousness, and social media, which is a whole another topic, is a huge problem. And it was very clear just from raising my own kids what a huge problem this is. So this is something that we've been aware of, and I'm really glad to see the increasing consensus. But I just want to note for folks in the audience that I think there's just such a gap between the rhetoric oftentimes about policymaking, where policymakers will say we solved the problem, we banned phones, and they have a press conference, versus the hard job of educators who are participating in this webinar to actually ensure that schools become distraction free or have far less distractions. So we thought it was very important to create a resource that was extremely concrete and practical. And I just want to reiterate a couple of things to what Angela said. What we found, and we partnered with Angela's team, and she was very generous in directing us to positive outliers. So we interviewed many, many educators who were the highest Fidelity implementers had the highest level of satisfaction, and they said the same things over and over and over again. One, that instruction time only policies do not work, that it puts the teacher in a similar position of enforcement. It causes kids to continue to violate, and teachers will selectively enforce. So the policy that works is bell to bell. And then to Angela's also really important point, how do you do that most effectively? There are four policies that matter, that make the most difference. And we actually rated them. We share the cost. So I just encourage everyone to take a look at the guide as a resource. But one is no phones at school at all. And that's not going to fly anywhere other than elementary schools generally. Cell phone lockers, lockers only, and lockable pouches. And that goes to Angela's point about distance. Anything else really is at all close in terms of effectiveness. And the other important thing is just to be very strict in enforcement without being punitive or unfair. And certainly, that's a huge issue in terms of equity. And we lay out an enforcement policy that has been consistently effective. So it does take leadership, it does take effort. But the thing we heard over and over again, I'll just end with this, is that educators said over and over that in the beginning it was challenging. There was some pushback in almost every case, but that it died down quite quickly. And then often, not only are the overwhelming majority of parents happy about it, teachers are happy about it, but students also express a lot of satisfaction.
Um, so one thing I wanted to talk about, and I think Lisa, you'll be able to hit on this, because I think your recent white paper argues that bans are a starting point. It's important to think about, I think, the after school snapback. So what happens at the end of the day when students get those phones back? Are they or come out of the pouches, or whatever enforcement mechanism there is? Like, can you talk a little bit about like how you prepare students for just healthy digital and cell phone use? And Joseph, I know the Digital Citizenship Coalition at ISTSC does a lot about that. So I would love your thoughts on that question too.
Yeah, and I actually think, Joseph, you said it beautifully, which is the bands really help to focus on, obviously the bands have value, right? They help to kind of focus on that distraction component. And I think what Joseph had shared was, but it basically reiterates the force that you only know how to use a device when an adult learns how to take it away from you. And I said that piece there, I think, is really important. And so I actually think the bans are a value, but they are also incomplete. And I think what we're talking about here is really like, what do we need to do to go beyond just the school day and making sure that we're preparing students for what happens when they get those devices back, right? Because that's a reality. And we've seen, Jonah and Angela, you talk about kind of the bell to bell. Without the bell to bell, we see students skipping eating lunch. We see students racing to the school bus and not talking to each other on the school bus for the entire way there. They're not talking to friends afterward. They're not doing their homework because they're so anxious about getting their devices back. And so that really suggests that we've created really a temporary boundary, but not necessarily something that helps to support kind of self-regulation or judgment. And so, that's to me where the real work really needs to kick in after the ban, right? In partnership with that, whereas the policy can help kind of part of the day, but what do you do for the other 15 plus hours? And so I think schools really have to work to prepare students for the guidance to make sure that we're preparing kind of those lasting impact, those judgment skills, so that they're really making sure that they can build that long-term muscle on, making sure that we don't have to take things away for them to understand and learn those judgment.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, our stance is that we should help learners become digital citizens, that school is actually a great place for them to practice responsible use of technology. And if the legislature makes it impossible to put a cell phone in their hand at all, then we're not opening up the possibility for the school to engage in some really useful developmental experiences with those students to help them have a healthy relationship with their device. I think of a school in Philadelphia where they had this problem. They did a pause. They banned cell phones, not because the state legislature told them to, because they saw the issue themselves. And then they sat down with the students and they said, hey, this is a problem. We want to solve this together. And they engaged the students in the process and said, what would make sense to you? How can we optimize learning? How can we show respect for your agency? How can we make this work for the educators? And in the end, they came up with a policy that's working, where the devices are held by the teacher, and it requires a teacher's permission for the student to use the device in class. And while I think that's that policy I think is a really interesting one, what I think is particularly interesting is that they involve the students in a process that was going to help those students learn to use the technology responsibly in the future. So it wasn't like you said, Lisa, you turn off a tap and then they just like turn it on like crazy the minute they get the chance. And there's no learning about regulating behavior. And so, some people may think that we should take all the regulation of digital behavior and not have that be part of what you learn in school. We actually think it's essential life skill, and school should be part of the process of helping students learn to regulate that behavior.
And can I add one thing? Because we've all kind of said or heard a couple times on this intro. I know it's just an intro. Sorry, Thomas. Which is, obviously it's easy to dismiss it at elementary school. I actually think there's danger in that too, because the reality is kids in elementary school who can develop these habits early on what it means, like Joseph just said, showing them what it means, showing them to pause, when is the right time to use it, actually creating those critical skills as early as kindergarten can be really impactful when they get to middle school and high school. So it's not so much of a ban as much as I've now created some habits and healthy habits that I've learned as early as, the age of 5, 6, and 7, when we know these kids have devices in their hands.
Anyone else want to add in on that topic?
Maybe I'll just briefly say I agree with Joseph and Lisa about the opportunity for young people to learn to self-regulate. Just as a moment of introspection, all of us might think, what is our relationship with our phones? That has been a survey item that I recently asked adults across this country, parents across this country, kids across this country, young adults across this country, and the adults actually, clearly have a lot of ambivalence about our relationship with our phones. And most people in this country who are above the age of 18 feel like they spend too much time on their devices. So it's not like we can look at kids and be like, well, they just got to learn to catch up with us. I think for a lot of us, we're on our own journeys. So I agree that there's an opportunity to learn this skill that all of us are struggling to learn. And I guess I would just add two things as a psychologist. Like, one is when we give the what, we should always give the why, right? So whatever the policy is and however the process works out, like kids should be given a metacognitive understanding of what's going on. And one thing that I would like to see educators emphasize is the principle of situational agency, that research shows that willpower doesn't work at any age. It doesn't work when you're 4. It doesn't work when you're 54. So you cannot will yourself not to be on your phone, no matter who you are. It doesn't work for very long. You can use your situation. You can create physical distance between you and temptations, and that actually creates psychological distance. So the principle of situational agency is something we can all learn. It's never too early. I completely agree that 5-year-olds, and this research shows this too, 5-year-olds can learn these metacognitive skills, and they need some scaffolding to do that. So I agree. And the second thing I'll just add is that if we are talking about this as a learning opportunity, I think, and then, amplifying a little bit of what Joanna was saying, I do think there's an opportunity to explain that there are some temptations in life that are not solved individually, but they are solved collectively. That is why societies have laws and that they have traditions and rituals. And, it goes for kids, but it goes for the rest of us, that it is what economists would call, this is a collective action problem, that in this opportunity, we can also learn that sometimes there has to be coordination across people, and it's not just what you do on your own.
Thank you. Julia, you're coming at this from a bit of a different perspective in that you're building tools for schools. And so I would love to hear what you're hearing from districts about what they need in the tools to manage cell phone bans and restrictions.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Thomas. A little background, I've been working in this space now for just about 7 years. So I saw this all the way from pre-COVID when people were maybe having an inkling that unfettered access to technology, the more the better, wasn't necessarily the right way. And then seeing it all through this current moment where bipartisan bans are sweeping the nation at this unprecedented rate. So I think this social norming or collective action around this is really great because people are now feeling allowed to take actions, and the bans being the right first step in addressing this issue that has really been bubbling under the surface for quite some time now. Up until recently, it hit its tipping point over the past 2 years, I'd say. Action is better than inaction in this case. But reducing distractions is happening with this current movement. Student or schools are implementing policies and in many cases using tools to create that initial shift. And that's important because if your baseline is zero or no policy, going from zero to something does make a difference. But where districts are getting stuck right now and what we're hearing is what happens next. Maintaining consistency day to day, like Angela mentioned, willpower alone ultimately ends up fading away. And current tools become difficult because most of these solutions rely on students and teachers to execute something daily in order for it to actually work with fidelity. So that over time starts to break down. So my co-founder and I saw this happen in thousands of schools across the world when we were supporting them in implementing these physical tools, trying to support their student cell phone policies. And I think the easiest thing to do when feeling an overwhelming pressure to address a public health issue, which this is to just say no or to ban it. And we all have heard that one before, and we know how just say no played out. So to your question about where current tools are falling short from school leaders' perspectives, it's because they're not dynamic or easy to use. A common misconception is that cell phone bans mean no phones, which we know isn't the case. When you read most state mandates, they're calling for daily use restrictions unless the phone is needed for an academic, medical, or emergency purpose. So on any given day, students might need access to their phone for dual factor authentication to get into a program on their school issued laptop. Students with diabetes might need to check their blood glucose levels on an app called Dexcom. And for safety, we know that some state law enforcements partner with schools on safety apps for students where they can actually report anonymous tips when they feel like their safety is threatened. So there's really cool and innovative ways aligned with state mandates that students are using their phones. And all these use cases, like I said, fall under allowable use in the statewide bans where current all or nothing solutions that rely on locks or collection methods are falling short. So this is really where I believe tech is able to solve tech and provide a nuanced solution to support student agency, safety, and generate buy-in from parents who don't want their students' phones locked away, but they also don't believe that the students should be using TikTok in math class. So current physical solutions such as pouches or shoe racks on teachers' doors. I've even heard of schools using Ziploc baggies. All of those ways are extremely time consuming on behalf of the teachers and administrators who are constantly playing this game of phone police whack-a-mole to figure out who's bypassing the system by using burner phones, claiming they didn't bring a phone, or in some cases, using objects shaped as phones in place of an actual phone. So to summarize where the current policy and tools are falling short from our perspective and experience, like I mentioned before, schools are seeing early wins going from zero to policy and maybe even a basic implementation support tool, but they're really running into friction with daily accountability, enforcement, teacher innovation, and supporting student agency.
And I'd just say if I could jump in, I mean, Julie is so thoughtful, and she's seen the arc of this from working at Yonder to starting her own company. And we had a good chance to visit, yesterday. This is such a nuanced and vexing problem, and we haven't even brought up the challenge of school issued, laptops and tablets, and how many, students migrate to the same distractions using the school issued device as they're using the phone for. So, I don't think there's any question that, to Angela's earlier point, that you can, and Julia reinforced this, that you go from, no policy or a classroom time only policy where it's only up to the teacher to a school-wide policy that aligns with evidence, the emerging evidence, which is to create as much distance as possible between the student and their phone. And you see dramatically positive results with, effective implementation. We interviewed so many educators, administrators who talked about suspensions going down dramatically, bullying going down dramatically, kids eating more food at lunch because they weren't afraid of being videoed and fat shamed, more books being withdrawn from the library. In addition to teachers having to redo lesson plans because they have so much more time for instruction. This shows you how fundamental this issue is. And at the same time, it is a laudable goal to want to teach kids to be digital citizens. I question that. I applaud that and I affirm that as a human being and as a parent. But I've seen that, over time, there's really no match for all humans of any age, but particularly adolescent humans, with cell phones and with social media. The algorithms, and the addictive sophistication is just too strong. So I think this is an emerging area where we all need to keep being open and asking questions. And I think Julia is taking a very innovative approach. I just would worry if I were an educator of trying to take a developmental approach with a problem that really has shown itself to be far too powerful, for somebody to self-manage.
Related to that, so I'm curious. I have used different app tools and like Brick, and I'm sure we all get those ads to try and reduce my screen time and device use. Curious, anyone have other folks on the panel done like quick show of hands of who has tried something to manage their screen time and can share how that went?
Well,
Uh,
I teach a seminar called Technology and the Good Life, and so sometimes I have founders of, Bloom, Brick, and so forth, come to my class, and so, then we hand out the little widget, and my undergraduates try it. I, haven't done it myself. I think for me, the compulsion to check TikTok and so forth isn't quite as strong as it is for my 19-year-old students. But I will tell you that I was surprised that, 2, 3, 4, 7 weeks later, I said, is anybody still using these things? And quite a number of hands went up. So I do think that there is a hardware, like a sort of physical solution. So as you know, some of these things are like, well, when you have your phone with you, it doesn't work unless you have like the card, which you strategically leave back in your apartment. Jonah brought up Chromebooks, right, and how we have not yet in this conversation addressed those. I do think, and I'm sure Julia would want to say more about this, the current status is that everything is co-located right here. The
yeah.
QR code you need to get into the concert, your map, your phone numbers, your ability to text your mother, like everything is co-located there. That is, of course, one of the reasons why everybody on this call goes to the bathroom with their phone. Like that's, ridiculous, and yet we all do it. Or maybe I'm just speaking personally. I do think one of the challenges is how maybe as a society we can start to separate functions so that it's not like you could have every virtue, but also every vice right here co-located in the same 3 by 6 inch device. And if we can at least grasp that principle that physical distance creates psychological distance, the absence of physical distance creates the absence of psychological distance. So anyway, I took that, question in a slightly different direction, but I do think the reason why my 19-year-olds are saying like, yes, some of these devices are helpful is that it's beginning to help them solve the problem of co-location.
I, I mean, that is exactly what the Commons was designed to do. And like, it's literally like make the phone boring again. How do you, and I think Brick does an amazing job of that too for individuals who we don't have this ability for. Brick is a good example of an individual taking agency over their own device use. And then from a public health perspective and doing this from a social norming perspective at large scale across a school, how do you actually design a solution that solves the problem of co-location and making the phone boring again and helping to actually sever those impulses to reach for your phone when it's boring because all of the things on your phone that make it attractive and release high levels of dopamine are being blocked. So over time, you're creating that practice environment during school where the phone becomes boring. Your impulses are getting lowered and lowered because when you pick up your phone to go on TikTok and get that hit of dopamine, it's simply not available. And actually, in February, there's this really cool research article that was published. Maybe you all have read it, but blocking mobile internet on smartphones improves sustained attention, mental health, and subjective well-being. Basically, they just blocked the internet from people's phones. This was a causal study that was published from researchers up in Canada. I can share the link afterward, but it was really cool because it talked about this issue of co-location and everything being on one device.
Well, and I think both Angela and Julia are pointing out a really important aspect of this for an education leader is, we've done a terrible job implementing the technology in our schools this way, right? So we haven't even done the experiment of what happens when the technology is only about learning and not about distraction, right? So I'm
Yeah.
not surprised that when you have everything co-located, I loved how you said it, Angela, all the virtues, all the vices on one device. If that is the situation that we're facing, then a ban sort of makes sense there, right? But if we can distinguish between the two, then I think there is a place for technology in learning. I think the other word that really struck me that you said is making your phones boring. I think in addition to making our phones boringer, I would like us to think about making our classrooms more interesting to the students, more relevant, more aligned to their aspirations. It's, you know, I mean, I, I was a kid in school. There were no cell phones. I found many, many ways to be distracted in a boring class. I made them up, right? I invented my own. I didn't need technology to give them to me. I found my own ways to get dopamine hits. And so I think we also need to say to ourselves, what are we doing to make the learning experience so engaging that students are less interested in that? And, I'm just thinking about a classroom in California that they had a project with the classroom in Africa to help redesign stoves so that they had produced less carbon monoxide and less smoke in the village. And so you have these two groups of students working away, designing stoves, testing them out, sharing their findings. Nobody was grabbing for their phone in a situation like that. Now, you can't do that every day, right? And productive struggle is part of learning, as Angela will tell you, and I agree. But I think there's a lot of unproductive struggle and a lot of boredom that is also introduced in the classroom. That if we address that as well, I think that also needs to be considered.
I find the comment just to be really instructive from Nicasia Carriage Thomas. It just underscores um, the power of the phone. I mean, let's just call it for what it is. I mean, these are highly, highly, highly addictive. And if we were having a conversation about, whether we think students should be able to self-regulate with crack cocaine, I don't think people would be thinking, yeah, let's try to teach them and see if they can I don't know, Angela's much more um, you know, sophisticated about the analogy. Maybe it's a poor one, but it's an incredibly powerful draw. And I think the only thing you have to have abstinence, or forced abstinence, and in the most distance, the most friction. And if honestly, you can, as our guest, said, if you can get over it yourself, and I found that with my own Be Present app, by the way, which is basically an app that creates more friction. It just makes it a little harder, and it just says, "You sure? Are you sure? Are you sure?" And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." And I mean, it does discourage, don't get me wrong. But similarly, if you're an addict of any sort, if you're an alcoholic, don't go to bars. If you're an alcoholic, try not to live next to a liquor store. Um, but you have to have someone, really make a decision and to have support. And in the absence of that, the best thing to do, especially for someone with a developing brain, is to, force abstinence. Um, and I think what Julia, you were saying, it seems like it's a version of that. So by the way, to state agnosticism about the method, if geofencing can work and all the devices can be turned off, and then that's actually less friction and less work for the educators, then that makes sense. But I wonder, and the study you cited indicates that it contradicts, Angela, your point that you've made to me in the past about even in the presence of a phone, even if it's off, is a distraction. So I would be curious as to your comment on Julia's reference to that study.
So there is a very famous study that some of you have heard of, but maybe not everyone, called the Brain Drain Study, led by Adrian Ward, who is at University of Texas, Austin. Apparently, in the history of UT Austin, there's never been a study that, for example, warranted a full page story in the Wall Street Journal. So it got a lot of attention, and it's now been replicated many times. And the study is this: you give people an IQ test. These are not K-12 students, these are adults. But you randomly assign these adults who are taking an IQ test to one of three conditions. In one condition, they have their personal phone with them on a desk that they're taking the IQ test at, and that's kind of how most of us keep our phones, honestly. The second is like it's in their backpack, right? So it's not in sight, but it's close by. And then the third is it's in it's in another room. It's in a safe locker in another room. And the finding is that farther away it is, like the third condition in another room, like the highest IQ scores. The next is the backpack. And then finally, the lowest IQ scores are, your phone on your desk. It is very often the very first slide that professors use, no matter what they teach, because they're like, here's why you're not allowed to have your cell phone out in my classroom. Here's the brain drain study. There are three bars. They go up to the right. IQ is the vertical axis. As I said, it's been replicated. Now, one thing just to note is that this is before geofencing was even like the glimmer in anybody's eye. The study's now at least a year or two old. And so we don't know what the effects are of having your phone with you when it is boring, when it is a brick, when you can't access, TikTok or YouTube or maybe even your email on it. So that remains to be seen. But the reason why that article got so much attention is that at least with all of the bells and whistles, with the virtues and the vices co-located, it does seem like some of our attention goes to, what am I missing? Maybe I should check it. Maybe I shouldn't check it. And any of that subtracts from what you want, which is 100% engagement in what you're doing.
I'd like to just jump in real quick, Jonah. You kind of made a conversation around absence that I want to talk about, and the analogy to alcohol. And I always worry about that particular analogy because we can live without alcohol, right? Like, I mean, maybe some of us can't, I don't know, but from the perspective of we can survive, breathe, drink, like we can live, our hearts will still beat whether we drink or not. I like to actually think of kind of technology use and maybe cell phone use specifically more around nutrition and eating, because we actually can't survive without eating. And I think we spend a lot of time teaching kids about nutrition and healthy habits, and no doubt the correlation to some of those addictions, but like sugar is an unbelievably addicting, aspect. We don't teach kids not to eat bread. We teach kids what that moderation looks like. And we talk about some of those supports and how do we help people understand the impact of those, and kind of like, if you eat, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but the first thing my kids always say, as soon as I go off to college, I'm going to go and eat 60 pounds of chocolate. Guess what? They don't actually want to do that. And even my own 19-year-old, Angela, you talked about your 19-year-old students, but my 19-year-old went off to college, and the first thing he asked for the holidays was a digital camera so that he would be able to take photos without having his own phone. Right. So he wanted to create that self-regulation. So I'm not suggesting that these aren't extremely addictive devices and that we can't make sure that students have some boundaries, but I think that's a big piece of this. We have to teach them to have those boundaries, to teach them to, what does it mean? I don't think complete avoidance of those devices is realistic. It's everything they do now and societal in the next 10, 15 years, they're going to have to figure out how to use those devices in a functional way. And I think it has to be combined. So again, I'm not against bans at all. I do think that has a place in a classroom, but we have to make sure we're teaching them the skills and tools to moderate, to stop, to take a breath, and to make sure they're really thinking about, how do I create some of those? Do I want the brick, right? Like, should I put that on my own device? And making sure they're learning about those skills really early.
I'll just add one thing on food, because I do think that it is a good analogy. And I agree with you, Lisa. So we know some things about food, and we know about the science of ultra processed food. Ultra processed food is by definition food that you cannot make at home because the process of like desiccating and then fractionating and then reconstituting and then adding and then enhancing is just not possible in your home kitchen. And it has the effect of actually creating what scientists call supernormal stimulus. A supernormal stimulus is a stimulus which is outside the range of normal human experience. The things that you get in a single chip of like a Dorito, right? Like you can't make it from home, and there's nothing you can make at home which is that tasty. You know, the concentration of sodium, the balance with sweetness, the crunch, the color. So
Now we're all hungry.
Yeah, my mouth's watering right now, Angela. Stop.
I'm repulsed right now. So just
I know I picked Doritos because I find them especially alluring. But anyway, I'll just say that many social scientists are now thinking that social media is a supernormal stimulus and it is a digital Dorito, as
that's
Cal
right.
Newport puts it, because we have fractionated normal human experience, right? Like sometimes you get to see a glimpse of Taylor Swift. Like maybe sometimes, like, you know, things happen fast in your life, and sometimes there's, you know, a narrative and drama and conflict and resolution. And sometimes the colors are really awesome, like on a fall day, like amazing. But now, in 25 seconds, you have Taylor Swift with the exact, you know, soundtrack. It's 2x speed. It's talking right to you because I miss you. I haven't seen you in so long. So now we have like taken some of the elements of social experience, fractionated them, reconstituted them, put them together, added flavoring, added color, and it is no wonder that given the choice between an apple and a Dorito, most people, when they are co-located, will find it very difficult to repeatedly choose the apple over the Dorito. And we have the same problem, I think, playing out in technology.
Yeah, and I think the analogy here, Lisa, I mean, the food analogy is a better one than alcohol. Thank you. But we would not say that we think that, schools should offer ultra processed foods and like, super high sugar foods and hope and educate the kids and hope they'll make good choices.
Yeah, you're right. And so I think the other side of that is we do talk about nutrition in school. We do help them. We do provide the guidance and support. There's classes on it, right? That we make sure that students understand that. And we don't put it in the vending machines in the school,
Yeah.
Right. So
right?
it's a
So
both
it's
and.
not and, it's
It,
it's not or, it's and, right?
right.
And
So
I
it's,
absolutely agree.
yeah.
So I just want to bring up a point that, a phone is a platform, right? I, when my phone turned off is not addictive, right? It's just not because nothing is happening on the screen. And if I only put and only have access to apps that support my learning, it's also not addictive. It's not a Dorito. It's useful. And so I think we're talking about a device as if the device itself has magical powers. It's the algorithms in the social media, I believe, that we're talking about that have the magical powers that overwhelm us. And so I just want to draw a distinction there because I think technology platforms can be incredibly useful for learning and incredibly helpful. And I am uncomfortable moving the agency about those choices to the state legislature and not to the educators who might have really great ideas for how to make good use of those technology platforms.
And
Yeah.
I would just say,
I
oh,
think
sorry, Julia, please.
Well, to back up what you're saying, Joseph, I think beyond just like lived experience in this space, JAMA Pediatrics for 2 years in a row has released research showing that despite having a student cell phone policy in place, students are still spending on average an hour and a half of every school day on their devices, and 97% of that's on social media, gaming, YouTube, and algorithm-driven applications. It's not on so it's showing that academic apps are not derailing attention or focus. Maybe even the call and text aren't that big of a deal as we thought they were before. It's really these algorithm driven applications. And that really is the hypothesis of like, if you can remove those loudest noises, can students with these guardrails start practicing self-regulation in a practice controlled environment at school while learning agency over it and supporting them with education. And that's a huge part of what the Commons does that we felt that current tools are missing, is that we do have a 4-module digital citizenship curriculum that is part of every implementation so that students start understanding the why behind it, and they're getting to practice that every single day during school, whether their school has a phone-free bell-to-bell policy or maybe a more nuanced approach where you can use Google Classroom to submit an assignment.
Jill, if you could, I know that pediatrics, if you could, circulate those, I think they're really, if you read table 2, you're like, wow, and there is a socioeconomic gradient. When you look at how much time kids are spending on phones, okay, sure, but also what they're doing, it is depressingly what you would think. And so it is our most vulnerable students who are spending the most time doing things that are not great for their futures. And it is the most privileged students who are spending the least time.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, so the point being made also is just that if you take away the phone, you're not actually taking away the problem. But I haven't heard anything here that, indicates that we should be, sort of reconsidering the question of bell-to-bell policies and whether the implementation mechanism is Julia's technology or it's a cell phone locker or a Yonder pouch or another pouch. There has to be, distance, but there's other devices. And I think schools and school districts and, many folks in this call, I'm sure, are struggling with how do you filter in a way that actually works? Because, you can filter one website, or allow one website, and then kids can get to, any other site from that website through proxy sites. And it's just really, really hard. I had a conversation with Tammy Wincup from Securely, which is one of the sort of leading companies, doing filtering, and she underscored the complexity. Now, she said that in places that have banned phones, they see a massive increase in the amount of filtering that happens, with their service. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I feel like the stakes are incredibly high here on two fronts. One is mostly how to reduce distractions, and also, let's be honest, it's also a question of like, sort of interrupting or slowing, the sort of level of addiction, that kids develop early. And, addiction is sort of cumulative. And yes, there's a rebound effect and you can't control what happens. But if you can create an environment where kids actually do enjoy embodied experiences and actually learn and engage and build relationships, that's of great value in addition to the educational value. And we haven't talked, I think, enough about the sort of downside of allowing phones at lunch and allowing phones in passing periods, in terms of the other sort of antisocial behaviors. But the other poll, which is less important, but Joseph, you mentioned it, is this New York Times article that got posted by Anthony Jones here about the possible backlash, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and just banning all technology, because technology can be an incredible accelerant of learning, if deployed effectively. And it'd be a shame if we went from pillar to post here and like had no regulation and then had hyper regulation, and that then created more inequity for those who actually could benefit. So I just feel like this is a complicated debate, and our society doesn't do great with finding middle grounds. But I'm glad that at least the people that Whiteboard is making this possible, and this great panel is making it possible for us to think about a middle ground.
Joseph, I want to give you a chance to respond on that because I know we've talked a lot about like the evolution of cell phone bans to general ed tech bans.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's something we're really concerned about. Technology can actually be a really important equalizer of access for learners who lack some of the resources that more privileged students have at home. And so for some of them, those kinds of resources are primarily available at school or primarily available via school issued device. And so one of the things that I think can get a little bit lost in these conversations is, for and many of us who talk about them fall into the privileged class. We can easily envision an environment where we roll back technology at school and have plenty of access at home for everything we want to do with it. And that is not the case for many of our students in the schools in our country. And so I really think we want to be thoughtful about making sure that they have that access that they need. It's, if you think about, the first job that a student's going to get after they leave high school, what technology skills are they expected to have and where are they going to learn those? For those of us with privilege, you're going to learn them at home, you're going to be fine. Those without privilege, you may not learn those at home and you may not be fine. And so I really hope that we can, as Jonah said, not throw out the baby with the bathwater and really think thoughtfully and intentionally about how we do use technology and prepare students for a world where they're going to expect not only to use it professionally, but just to be digital citizens, just to, get online and not yell at each other. I would love for them to get some practice of that while they're still in school.
Well, and if I could reinforce Joseph and kind of bring that back. If we think back at the Doritos and we think about students aren't necessarily have necessarily some of the supports at home and all those pieces, they're going to be offered Doritos. We need to make sure that we help them understand the difference between a Dorito and an apple, where they might not necessarily get that at home. They might not necessarily have other options outside of, and again, Angela, and using your Dorito analogy as in terms of some of those pieces and parts, right? Like, yeah. And so I think that's where the education becomes so critical and helping students, even not only as Joseph was talking about having access to the technology in the classroom, but making sure that it's paired so closely with that understanding of how to use it, how to use it safely, what is judgment, how do you create those judgment pieces? You know, how do we just teach kids to stop and pause, like just pause and think critically, is this accurate? Is this kind, right? Or what does that mean? And just creating that habit now as early as possible for all students, regardless of their financial circumstances, right? Regardless to their access, because I do think, Joseph, as you talk about, we're not necessarily providing resources or limitations as much for those students who have kind of the same kind of family engagement at home. It's really those folks who don't necessarily have that access that we need to make sure that we can support.
Um, One question I got in the chat that I want to go to a quick round with everyone. Do you think this is a moment we'll look back on as the beginning of a permanent shift, or is this a pendulum that will swing back? Could start, Angela, you gonna go first?
Well, my high school French teacher, Dr. Roland, said in French, but I will say it in English, that all of history is action and reaction. And it's been a while since I graduated from high school, but I'm like, well, Dr. Roland kind of had it right. Now, that said, I don't think that this is going to be like, oh, now schools want to have extremely lax policies. In our data from over 100,000 teachers, when you ask them, is your school policy just right? Is it a little too strict? Is it a lot too strict? So you give them this like continuum, but the center is just it's overwhelmingly that these teachers are saying that they actually want more school-wide restrictive policies than they have. So does that mean that in a year it's going to be exactly the flip? And then I don't know. There's a lot of nuance to this issue, but I do think we are coming to a reckoning, not just for young people, but for all of us, that the technologies in our lives are not straightforward, and we do have to figure out a way forward. But many of us, maybe most of us, almost all of us, are saying, like, right now, it's not good.
Mm-hmm. I I would agree with that actually. Like when we talk to schools and district leaders about the shift that's going on, because it can sometimes feel like this all just happened overnight and these major societal issues are getting dumped on them and they have pressure from a bunch of stakeholders to make a quick decision. And it's like, yeah, we were at a place where the pendulum was way over here and unfettered access, the more technology, the better, was how things were going. And we all kind of woke up to that and were like, holy crap, we need to do something. And so we are in this moment where the pendulum has now swung completely to this other direction where the words that we're using and choosing to use are very intense. They're bans and they're prohibit. And I think where a lot of public health issues have come in is going from this way, swinging to this way, and then recognizing, well, people are going to be engaging in whatever this is, whatever, if it's sex, if it's drugs, if it's rock and roll, if it's phones. And then we started educating around it and we put up the proper guardrails to support time, place, and manner and how to educate around it. And my hope and what I see is that schools are also talking about swinging towards the middle because they're trying to figure out a way to balance all the priorities that they have and their obligation to prepare their students for the future. And that future, in order to be a leader in today's society, does involve technology and it does involve how to use your phone in a proper time, place, and manner in order to be successful. And so that's really the view of where I've seen this pendulum be at, where it is now, and hopefully where it's going in the future.
I think I agree with that. I would just add that one of the having worked on the federal level, when policies can be blunt instruments, and one of the things that they can do is they can prevent this sort of equalization over time to settling in on the right spot, because they are made in a moment of extreme emotion or extreme need, as the case may be. And then there's not a mechanism for allowing the ecosystem to innovate forward on it, right? And so if there are bans that are instituted by legislatures, then when we get the right technology and we get the right practices and when we get the right training, they may not, they may be illegal to implement them. And so I think my caution is that that we pay attention and give credence to educator agency, make sure that they have the agency to make changes in the future that make sense, and that we consider student agency. I really think the more we treat students as objects to be acted upon in a school setting, as opposed to agents who have a say, then we're disenfranchising them from the experience of education. And they're going to feel more and more left out, and the object of education, not the subject of education. And so I would hope that we can find a way forward that preserves the possibility that teacher agency and student agency and innovation can come together to a solution, and it won't be prevented by policy bans that can't be undone.
Yeah, I actually think that's a well said. If we think about that kind of pendulum piece, I've been in the education space for 25 plus years, and if there's anything I can say is constant, is that pendulum, right? Like, I mean, you can look at literacy, right? You can look at math, you can look at any of the core subjects, you can look at all of those pieces, and it's always a drastic shift from one to the next. And as soon as we get comfortable, one to the next, right? Everything, I mean, you can even look at Common Core in the same way. And so from a pendulum, I don't think that's necessarily going to change as it relates to kind of as we think about it. There has been some constants though, and I think some of the constants is that, and I think Joseph, you talked about this. What does it look like for teacher agency? What does it look like for student agency? Technology is probably a constant. Does that mean cell phone bans are a constant or not constant? I think that'll be interesting to see. And I think Joan and Angela, to your point, like there's lots of research and validation to say it's important. We're going to go too far, and then we're going to probably end up going too far the other direction, right? And so we'll continue to see that. But I think we continue to look at what does it mean for having the agency and the voice for the students and the teachers, and training and supporting them, giving them the resources and tools to be successful after school has to be a constant that that we have seen, right, consistently, over my 25 plus years.
I'd say like, the pendulum shift is definitely a constant in education. I think the thing that um, is lacking is acting based on evidence. And nobody here is naive enough to think that policymaking is going to start happening based on evidence at a state legislative level or definitely a federal level. But to the extent that you all who are participating and listening can make decisions based on evidence, kids are going to benefit, and that's the learning materials or resources you choose, the instructional methods or policies like the ones we're talking about. In contexts that will continue to evolve. The evidence from Angela's study, which is an incredible contribution, is very clear about the need to separate kids from their phones. The evidence for how to, ensure that kids are not using school-issued devices, is more gray, and it's something I think we all need to kind of figure out. The evidence of the importance of student agency is very clear as well. The question is, in this domain, whether or not agency is any match for addiction and the power of, phones. I personally don't think so. I think that, we also as a society in some ways has become, too permissive, and I think it's appropriate to set better boundaries. I do think we're going to look back, and I hope we look back and we, really regret the lack of regulation with regard to social media generally. Kids should not have access to social media until they're at least 16. I think Australia is getting that right. So I think as a society, hopefully we can band together and do what's right in terms of some of these larger risks and temptations and destructive forces, so that there is even sort of less of a need to try to build gates at a school level. anyway, I'm grateful for this opportunity to engage with an incredibly smart group of people. Thank you.
Jonah, if I could ask
Well,
say one more thing. You said something really important, which is the social media separated from the device. Well, you didn't say that, but like I think and I think Joseph, that's what you were saying too. We need to make sure that we're separating the addictive nature to what really is a valuable resources and tool. And how do we separate those pieces? Right now, we can't. We haven't been able to. Obviously, Julia, the kind of work you do helps to kind of create some of that.
Yeah,
But how
and
do we
also I think
separate that?
Julia's technology and her approach is extremely promising, and I want to read the digital citizenship curriculum because, even as her technology evolves, and hopefully bans that are effective take place, in whatever ways are most effective, I do think the digital citizenship, part of it is extremely important.
well, I know we're at time, and so I don't want to make folks late. We will share an email with the recording, and so the resources that folks have shared, and websites and all of that information. I think we have enough content for probably 2 to 3 more webinars. We'll work Doritos into the next title, really make it clickbaity, but lots of ground to cover. But thank you all so much for joining us and taking the time. It's great discussion.
Yeah, thanks for a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you for
thank you
facilitating,
all.
Thomas. Thank you all.